In the shadows of history lie the stories never told. This is Untold Text.
In the shadows of history lie the stories never told. This is Untold Text. When Japanese Type 97 tanks seemed invincible, until 8 were destroyed in 18 minutes. In the early years of World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army believed its armored forces were powerful enough to dominate the battlefields of Asia and the Pacific. Among their most trusted machines was the Type 97 Chiha medium tank. It was not the largest or the most heavily armored tank of the war, but the Japanese commanders, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, it was a symbol of speed, discipline, and battlefield superiority. For a time, that belief seemed justified. The rise of Japan's main battle tank, the Type 97 Chiha, was introduced in 1937. During Japan's expanding war in China, compared to earlier Japanese tanks, it was a major improvement. It weighed around 16 tons and carried a crew of -1 soldiers. Early versions had a 57mm gun, designed mainly for infantry support, while later models were upgraded with a more powerful 47mm high-velocity gun capable of fighting enemy armor. Japanese engineers designed the tank to move efficiently across rough terrain, in Asia's jungles and muddy battlefields. Heavy European-style tanks could struggle, but the lighter Type 97 performed well. Its mobility allowed Japanese forces to support infantry assaults and exploit breakthroughs quickly. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japanese armored units gained confidence in China. Their tanks often faced poorly equipped forces, with limited anti-tank weapons. The Chiha could move forward almost without fear, blasting enemy positions and helping infantry advance. By the time World War II expanded across the Pacific in 1941, Japanese commanders believed their armored forces could play a decisive role in future battles. Early victories strengthened the illusion. When Japan launched its massive offensive across Southeast Asia in late 1941, its forces moved with astonishing speed. In places like Korea and the Philippines, Japanese tanks helped spearhead attacks against Allied positions. At the time, many Allied units were simply not prepared for armored warfare. In the jungles, British and American forces often lacked effective anti-tank weapons, and their defensive lines were quickly broken by coordinated infantry and tank attacks. The Type 97 Chiha earned a reputation among Japanese soldiers as a dependable war machine. It could push through narrow roads, jungle trails, and muddy fields, where heavier tanks might get stuck. To many Japanese tank crews, it felt as if their vehicle could overcome almost any obstacle. This confidence gradually turned into something more dangerous. Overconfidence. Japanese planners assumed that their tanks would continue to dominate future battles in the Pacific, but the war was changing rapidly. A new enemy appears. In 1942, the United States began deploying large numbers of Marines and soldiers to the Pacific Islands. These troops arrived with modern equipment and new anti-tank weapons, specifically designed to stop armored assaults. One of the first major tests came during the brutal fighting on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This campaign became the first major offensive by Allied forces against Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Japanese commanders believed a tank attack could break through American defensive lines. They prepared a small armored force equipped with Type 97 tanks and planned a surprise assault against the U.S. Marines, holding key positions for the Japanese crews inside the tanks. The mission seemed straightforward. They had seen success before, and many believed the Americans would crumble once armored vehicles appeared, but this time, the Marines were ready. The deadly trap. As the Japanese tanks advanced toward the American lines, the battlefield seemed quiet. Dense jungle surrounded the area, and visibility was limited. From inside their armored vehicles, the tank crews could barely see beyond the trees. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. American anti-tank guns opened fire. Hidden in defensive positions, U.S. Marines had carefully placed their 37mm anti-tank guns along the likely approach routes. The moment the Japanese tanks entered the kill zone, the Marines unleashed a devastating barrage. The shells slammed into the thin armor of the Type 97 tanks. Unlike the thick armor of heavier European tanks, the Japanese vehicles had relatively light protection. The American shells penetrated easily, igniting fuel and ammunition. Within moments, the battlefield turned into chaos. One tank erupted into flames, another was hit and stopped in its tracks. A third tank attempted to maneuver, but another shell punched through its armor. The attack that Japanese commanders hoped would break the American line was collapsing almost instantly. 18 minutes of destruction. The engagement was shockingly short. In less than 20 minutes, roughly 18 minutes, according to many accounts, American Marines had destroyed 8 Japanese tanks. Some were knocked out by direct hits from anti-tank guns, others were finished off by artillery or concentrated machine gun fire, aimed at vision ports and weak spots. For the Japanese crews, it was a terrifying experience. Inside the cramped steel hulls of their tanks, they had little chance of escape. Once a shell penetrated the armor, the battlefield soon filled with burning wrecks of once proud armored vehicles. What had been intended as a powerful armored assault had turned into a disastrous failure. The harsh reality of Pacific tank warfare. The destruction of those tanks revealed a painful truth. For the Japanese military, the Type 97 Chiha was no longer adequate against modern Allied weapons. American forces possessed a growing arsenal of anti-tank technology. Their 37,000 guns could penetrate Japanese armor with ease. Soon even more powerful weapons would arrive, including bazookas and tanks like the M4 Sherman. Compared with the Sherman, the Type 97 looked outdated. The American tank had thicker armor, a larger gun, and better protection for its crew. In a direct confrontation, the Sherman usually held a decisive advantage. Japanese tanks were increasingly forced into defensive roles rather than offensive breakthroughs. The decline of Japanese armor as the war continued. Japanese armored forces struggled to keep up with the rapid technological improvements of the Allied armies. Battles, such as Battle of Saipan in 1944, showed just how difficult the situation had become. During desperate counterattacks, Japanese tanks attempted to charge American positions, only to be destroyed by tanks, artillery, and infantry weapons. Sometimes, entire tank units were wiped out in a single attack. Lacking resources and industrial capacity, Japan could not produce enough modern tanks to compete with a massive American war machine. By the final years of the war, many Japanese tanks were used almost like stationary bunkers. They were dug into defensive positions to support infantry rather than used, a lesson written in Steel and Fire. The destruction of 8 tanks in just 18 minutes became a powerful example of how quickly the balance of warfare could change. At the start of the war, Japanese armored forces had seemed unstoppable. In many parts of Asia, their tanks had supported rapid victories and impressive offensives. But the Pacific War was not static. New weapons, new tactics, and determined defenders transformed the battlefield. The Type 97 Chiha, once seen as a symbol of Japanese strength, gradually became a relic of an earlier phase of the war. And on that battlefield, where 8 tanks were destroyed. In less than 20 minutes, the illusion of invincibility vanished.